A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
Hi Herman and Corn. We have quite a robust civil society here in Israel. The country is often characterized for those who've moved here or lived here as being extraordinarily bureaucratic. And I actually think that it's a fairly outdated characterization. There's certainly many things about Israel criticisms of life here that I strongly agree with. Customer service generally being one of them. It remains, I think, quite bad overall. And we have a very limited conception of consumer rights, or very little meaningful enforcement of them. But overall, I actually find that the bureaucracy here is fairly manageable, and I think that the digital government efforts that Israel's been putting effort into, the digital transformation, is particularly strong. The use of electronic medical records at the health level, but also the digitization of government. I think it's done fairly well. But there's a few organizations that exist whose name is about improving democracy in Israel. We have the Israeli Democracy Institute, and we have the Movement for Better Governance in Israel. And these are quite vocal organizations that often will make statements to the media where it feels that the democratic principles are not being applied properly here. Often a lot of the debate in Israel particularly has involved this kind of spat seemingly between the judiciary and the political echelon, that the political echelon is continuously accused of trying to destroy the judiciary, and the judiciary is up in arms about that. And it's a very divisive issue that I can't say I'm very well informed about, but there's mutual recriminations, needless to say. What I'd love to understand a bit in greater depth, Herman and Corn, is imagine we were to create a KPI dashboard for the health of a democracy, a health check for a democracy. We'd need some metrics, and we need to agree upon what we're actually aiming for. When we talk about movements to improve the exercise of democracy in a country, in any country is going to have a different system of governance and a slightly different flavor of democracy. So my first question is, to what extent can we internationalize this question of what is a good democracy? What's bad democracy? What are some things that are anti-democratic? What are some things that are manifestations of a good democracy? And the second question is, if we were putting together this KPI dashboard for the health of democracy in a country such as Israel, what would we be charting up there? What are the metrics that we would have? And when you have organizations that criticize governance in Israel, or watchdogs that exist to provide reporting into that, what are some of the things that they would be looking into, and what are some of the things in reality that some of the movements we have here in Israel have actually reported on? Over to you two.
You know, Herman, I was reading a piece the other day that argued democracy isn't a destination, it's a practice. It's something you have to do every day, like a form of maintenance. It's not just a status you achieve and then forget about. It's more like a garden or a vintage car. If you stop tuning the engine or pulling the weeds for even a week, things start to degrade.
Herman Poppleberry here. And you are absolutely right, Corn. It's much more of a verb than a noun. It's an active, ongoing process of negotiation between the governed and those who govern. And that brings us perfectly to the prompt Daniel sent over today. Daniel is asking us about the internationalization of democracy metrics. He wants to know if we can actually define what a good or bad democracy looks like across different cultures and systems, and what a hypothetical KPI dashboard for democratic health would even look like. He also touched on the specific situation in Israel where he lives regarding watchdog organizations and the friction between the judiciary and the political branches.
It is a massive topic, and honestly, a bit intimidating. Daniel mentioned that he finds the bureaucracy in Israel more manageable than the stereotypes suggest, especially with the digital transformation efforts. He's seeing a government that works quite well on a technical level. You can book appointments, pay fees, and access records online with relative ease. But he's also seeing these deep-seated tensions in how the government actually functions at the constitutional level. It raises a really interesting question. Can you have a highly efficient digital government that is still struggling with the core tenets of democracy? Or are those two things inextricably linked?
That is the million-dollar question. Efficiency and democracy are not always on the same team. You can have a very efficient autocracy, at least in the short term. If you don't have to worry about public consultation, environmental impact reports, or judicial review, you can build a bridge or launch an app very quickly. But for a democracy to be healthy, you need more than just a slick app to pay your taxes or check your medical records, though those are great for quality of life. You need accountability. You need checks and balances. You need the friction that Daniel is seeing in Israel, because that friction is often the sound of the brakes working.
Right. And Daniel specifically asked about internationalizing these definitions. It feels like every country wants to claim they are a democracy, but they all mean something slightly different by it. Even some of the most repressive regimes in the world have democratic in their official names. Is there a way to create a universal standard, or is that just Western centrism in disguise? Are we trying to force a square peg into a round hole by applying a Swiss or American model to the rest of the world?
There's a lot of academic debate on that, but there are some gold standards we can look at that try to move beyond Western centrism. If we're talking about internationalizing the definition, we have to look at projects like the Varieties of Democracy, or VDEM, based out of the University of Gothenburg. They are currently the world's largest data collection project on democracy. They don't just look at whether you have elections. They break it down into 5 high-level principles: electoral, liberal, participatory, deliberative, and egalitarian. This allows them to measure democracy in a way that respects different institutional setups.
That's a lot of categories. Most people just think of democracy as we get to vote. But VDEM is saying that's just one piece of the puzzle. Can we break those down? Because if we're building a KPI dashboard, these sound like our primary tabs.
The electoral component is the baseline. Do you have free and fair elections? Is there a real choice? But the liberal component is where things get interesting for Daniel's question. That's about the protection of individual and minority rights against the tyranny of the majority. It's about the rule of law and judicial independence. When Daniel talks about the spat between the judiciary and the political echelon in Israel, which has been a major flashpoint since the judicial reform proposals of 2023, he's talking about a potential crisis in the liberal component of democracy, even if the electoral component is still functioning perfectly well.
So, if we were to build this KPI dashboard Daniel's asking for, the first metric would have to be something about judicial independence. How do you actually measure that, though? It's not as simple as counting votes. You can't just put a sensor on a judge's gavel.
It isn't simple, but it is measurable. You have to look at things like the process for appointing judges. Are they appointed by politicians or by a nonpartisan body? In Israel, this has been a huge point of contention. Who gets to sit on the Judicial Selection Committee? You also look at security of tenure. Can judges be fired for making decisions the government doesn't like? You also look at the frequency with which the government ignores court rulings. If the Supreme Court says a law is unconstitutional, like the Israeli High Court did in early 2024 regarding the Reasonableness Amendment, and the government just says, too bad, we're doing it anyway, your judicial independence KPI is flashing bright red.
That makes sense. It's about the teeth of the judiciary. We've talked about this in a different context back in episode 611 when we discussed the Jerusalem light rail and the aggressive ticket enforcement. That was a case where the rules felt arbitrary and the power dynamic was heavily skewed against the individual. That's a micro example of what happens when the rule of law becomes rule by law, where the law is just a tool for the powerful rather than a shield for the citizen. If the courts can't protect a passenger from an unfair fine, how can they protect a minority group from an unfair law?
That's a great connection, Korn. Rule of law versus rule by law is a critical distinction for our dashboard. Another metric we would definitely need is media freedom. This is often measured by organizations like Reporters Without Borders. They look at things like the number of journalists killed or imprisoned, but also more subtle things like media ownership concentration. If all the major news outlets are owned by 3 friends of the Prime Minister, or if the government uses state advertising budgets to reward friendly outlets and punish critics, your democracy is in trouble even if no one is being arrested. In Israel, there's been a lot of talk about the politicization of the public broadcaster, KAN, which is a key indicator to watch.
And what about civil society? Daniel mentioned the Israel Democracy Institute and the Movement for Quality Government. Those are watchdog organizations. In a healthy democracy, these groups are active, they're funded, and they aren't being harassed by the state. They are like the independent auditors of the democratic system.
Right? We call that diagonal accountability. Vertical accountability is when the voters hold the government accountable in an election. Horizontal accountability is when one branch of government, like the courts or the state comptroller, holds another branch accountable. But diagonal accountability is when citizens, organized into groups or through the media, force the government to answer questions and change behavior between elections. If a government starts passing laws to restrict the funding of non-governmental organizations or NGOs or labels them as foreign agents just for disagreeing with policy, that's a huge warning sign on the dashboard.
I'm curious about the specific governance issues Daniel mentioned. He talked about the political echelon accusing the judiciary of overreach, and the judiciary being up in arms about it. This seems to be a recurring theme in many democracies lately. We see it in the United States, in Hungary, in Poland. How does a watchdog organization even report on that without becoming part of the political fight themselves? It feels like the moment you criticize a politician, you're labeled as the opposition.
It's a tightrope walk. Organizations like the Israel Democracy Institute, or IDI, try to stick to data. They produce an annual democracy index. They track public trust in institutions like the police, the Knesset, the courts, and the media. When trust in the courts drops significantly, they report it as a warning sign. They don't necessarily say the politicians are wrong, but they say the health of the institution is declining because the public no longer believes it is impartial. They also look at political polarization. If the gap between how different groups view the legitimacy of the system is widening, the system is becoming brittle.
That trust metric seems vital. If people don't trust the system, they stop participating. Or worse, they start looking for strongman alternatives who promise to fix everything by breaking the rules. Do we include public trust as a KPI? And how do we differentiate between healthy skepticism and destructive cynicism?
It's a leading indicator. If trust in the electoral process drops, you can bet that voter turnout or social stability will follow. In Israel, the movement for quality government often focuses on more concrete things like corruption and the appointment of unqualified cronies to civil service positions. That's another great KPI, the meritocracy versus patronage ratio. How many government jobs are filled by experts who passed a civil service exam versus political loyalists? If you replace the professional legal advisors in every ministry with political appointees, you've effectively dismantled a layer of internal accountability.
Daniel mentioned that he's actually impressed with the digital government efforts in Israel. Electronic medical records, digitizing services. In a way, that's a form of transparency, right? If I can see my own records and track my interactions with the state, it's harder for a bureaucrat to hide behind a pile of paper or demand a bribe to find a file.
It can be, but digital transformation is a double-edged sword. It can lead to open government, which is a positive KPI. That's where data is published in machine-readable formats so that journalists and researchers can analyze it. But it can also lead to increased surveillance and centralized control. If the government has a digital record of every single thing you do, and there are no strong privacy laws or independent courts to prevent the abuse of that data, the potential for a digital panopticon is huge. So, on our dashboard, we would need a metric for data privacy and digital rights. We have to ask who owns the data and what are the safeguards against its misuse for political targeting.
I'm thinking back to episode 475, where we talked about the air quality crisis in Israel. That felt like a failure of responsiveness. The data showed there was a problem. The public was literally gasping for air, as we put it, but the policy didn't change for a long time because of industrial lobbying. Is responsiveness a measurable KPI?
It is, though it's harder to quantify. You can look at the time lag between a major public health crisis or a widespread protest and the introduction of relevant legislation. You can also look at consultation scores. Does the government actually hold public hearings that influence the final law? Or is the public comment period just a box-ticking exercise? In a healthy democracy, the government should be responsive to the needs of the people, not just the demands of their biggest donors or the most extreme elements of their coalition.
So let's try to summarize what's on this dashboard so far. We have judicial independence, media freedom, strength of civil society, public trust in institutions, the meritocracy ratio in civil service, digital transparency versus privacy, and government responsiveness. That's a pretty robust list. But is it enough?
It's a good start. But if we want to truly internationalize it, we have to account for different models. Some democracies are majoritarian, like the United Kingdom, where the winner of an election has a lot of power to push through their agenda. Others are more consensual, like many European countries or Israel's parliamentary system, where you have to build coalitions. The KPIs might look different for each. In a coalition system, a key metric might be minority representation. How much power do small parties have to block or influence legislation? And conversely, does that power lead to minority tyranny, where a tiny group can hold the whole country hostage?
That's where it gets complicated. Too much power for small parties can lead to gridlock, where nothing gets done. We've seen that in Israel with the 5 elections in less than 4 years between 2019 and 2022. Does government stability go on the dashboard?
Yes, but with a caveat. Too much stability can be a sign of stagnation or even creeping authoritarianism. You want a healthy level of turnover. If the same person has been in power for 20 years, your democratic renewal, KPI, is probably in the basement. You want to see that the opposition has a realistic path to power. If the rules of the game are rigged so that the incumbent can never lose, you aren't in a democracy anymore, you're in an electoral autocracy.
This is making me think about the Board of Peace concept we discussed in episode 862 regarding Gaza. That was an extreme example of trying to build a governance model from scratch in a crisis. One of the metrics there was basic service delivery as a prerequisite for democratic legitimacy. If people don't have water, electricity, and safety, they don't care about your KPI for judicial independence. They care about survival.
That's a vital point, Korn. There's a hierarchy of needs for democracy. This is something that organizations like the World Bank and the United Nations track through their governance indicators. They look at government effectiveness and regulatory quality. If the state can't perform its basic functions, collecting trash, keeping the peace, providing health care, the democracy, part is often just a facade. Daniel's observation about the digital government in Israel being quite strong is actually a very positive sign for the underlying health of the state. It means the administrative state is functioning, even if the political state is in turmoil.
It's like the plumbing is working even if the people living in the house are shouting at each other. As long as the water is running and the lights are on, the house is still standing. But if the shouting leads to someone taking a sledgehammer to the support beams, then the plumbing won't matter for much longer.
That is exactly the concern of the watchdog groups like the Movement for Quality Government. They see the judiciary as a support beam. When politicians talk about overcoming Supreme Court decisions with a simple majority, the so-called override clause, they are essentially saying they want to be able to remove those support beams whenever they feel like it. The watchdogs argue that in a country like Israel, which has no formal written constitution and only one legislative chamber, the Supreme Court is the only real check on executive power.
And the counter-argument from the politicians is usually something like, we were elected by the people, and the judges weren't. Who are they to tell us what to do? How does our KPI dashboard handle that tension between popular will and constitutional constraints?
That's where you look at the deliberative and participatory metrics from that VDEM model I mentioned. Deliberative democracy asks, is the public debate based on facts? Is it respectful? Are different viewpoints actually considered before a law is passed? If the legislative process is just a series of late-night power plays with no real debate, your deliberation score is low. Participatory democracy looks at things beyond just voting, like local town halls, petitions, and direct engagement. If the popular will is just a slogan used to silence dissent, the dashboard should reflect that.
I remember in episode 448, we talked about the Atzmai experience, the freelancers in Israel, and how they felt left out of the social safety net during the pandemic. That's a participation issue. A specific segment of the population felt like the system wasn't designed for them, and they had no way to influence it. If a democracy doesn't include everyone in its success, those people will eventually stop supporting the democracy itself.
Right? If large groups of people feel systematically excluded from the benefits of the state, the legitimacy of the democracy starts to erode. So, economic inclusivity, or social safety net coverage, could actually be seen as indirect KPIs for democratic health. A democracy where everyone is starving or precarious is a democracy waiting to collapse into the arms of a populist who promises bread in exchange for freedom.
Okay, so we've got a very comprehensive dashboard now. We've got the technical efficiency, the institutional checks, the social trust, and the economic inclusion. But who actually gets to hold the remote? Who decides when a metric has gone from yellow to red? Is it an international body like the United Nations, or is that too prone to political bias?
In an ideal world, it's a combination of domestic watchdogs and international bodies. But the most important person holding the remote is the individual citizen. That's what Daniel is doing. He's observing, he's asking questions, he's noticing the gap between the slick digital interface and the messy political reality. The health of a democracy depends on millions of people doing exactly that, paying attention to the boring stuff before it becomes a crisis.
It feels like there's a certain level of noise that's normal in any democracy. People are always going to disagree. Protests are actually a sign of life, not a sign of death. If there are no protests, that's when I'd be worried. If everyone is quiet, it usually means they're either perfectly happy, which is rare, or they're too afraid to speak.
Right to assembly is a core KPI. If people are out in the streets and the police are protecting their right to be there, that's a healthy sign. If the police are using excessive force, or if the government is using emergency regulations to shut down protests, the civil liberties, KPI takes a hit. In Israel, we've seen massive, sustained protests over the last few years, with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets week after week. Regardless of which side of the judicial debate you're on, the fact that those protests can happen for months on end without being crushed is a testament to the strength of the democratic culture there.
So, to Daniel's first question, can we internationalize the definition? It sounds like we can, as long as we use a multidimensional approach. We can't just use one number, like a democracy score from 1 to 10. We need a suite of metrics that account for different historical contexts and institutional setups.
Yes, you can't compare a young democracy like Israel, which was founded in 1948 and has been in a state of conflict for much of its existence, directly to a country like Switzerland without acknowledging those structural differences. Israel doesn't even have a formal written constitution, but rather a set of basic laws that are passed by the Knesset. This makes the system more flexible, but also more vulnerable. The core principles, however, accountability, rule of law, individual rights, those are universal. They are the operating system of any functional democracy.
What are some of the key governance issues that watchdog organizations in Israel are reporting on right now, specifically? Beyond the big judiciary fight? What are the quiet issues that Daniel might be seeing in the news?
One big one is the politicization of the civil service. There's been a lot of concern about changes to how legal advisors in government ministries are appointed. Traditionally, they were independent professionals who could tell a minister, no, you can't do that, it's illegal. There's a push to make them political appointees, which would essentially turn them into yes men. Watchdogs like the Movement for Quality Government are fighting that tooth and nail because it removes the internal immune system of the government.
That's a huge one. If you remove the internal checks and balances within the ministries, the only thing left is the courts. And if you're also weakening the courts, then you've basically removed all the brakes from the car. You're just hoping the driver doesn't decide to go off a cliff.
Another issue is transparency in government spending, specifically regarding the coalition funds. In Israel, these are large sums of money, billions of shekels, that are handed out to political parties as part of the deal to form a government. They're often spent on very specific sectarian interests like religious schools or settlement projects, with very little oversight or professional criteria. Watchdogs are constantly calling for more transparency and more criteria-based allocation for that money. They want to know, is this money being used for the public good, or is it just a bribe to keep the coalition together?
It's interesting how much of this comes down to boring administrative stuff. It's not all high-stakes drama in the Supreme Court with judges in robes. A lot of it is just about how the money is spent, who gets hired for middle management jobs, and whether a legal advisor can say no to a boss.
But that's where the rot starts, Corn. If you normalize small-scale corruption or political patronage, it eventually eats away at the foundation of the whole system. If people see that you get a job because of who you know, not what you know, they lose faith in the meritocracy. That's why these watchdog groups are so important. They're like the white blood cells of the democracy. They're constantly looking for infections, a conflict of interest here, an illegal appointment there, and trying to neutralize them before they spread.
I like that. The immune system of democracy. That's a powerful way to think about it. And it suggests that a certain amount of inflammation, like a heated public debate or a legal challenge, is actually a sign that the immune system is working. It means the body is fighting back against something that shouldn't be there.
Precisely. If there's no reaction when a rule is broken, that's when the patient is in real trouble. That's when the democracy is immunocompromised. In Israel, the inflammation has been very high lately, which is exhausting for the citizens, but it shows that the democratic spirit is very much alive. People care enough to fight over these rules.
So for our listeners who are hearing this and thinking about their own countries, what are the practical takeaways? How can they look at their own democracy dashboard without needing a PhD in political science?
First, I'd say, don't just look at the headlines, look at the institutions. Is your local press independent? Can they criticize the government without being sued into oblivion? Are your courts being threatened or packed with partisans? Second, look at the merit factor. When you interact with the government, like Daniel did with the digital services, does it feel like you're dealing with a professional or a political hack? Is the plumbing working? And third, support your local watchdogs. These organizations often rely on small donations and volunteer work. They're the ones doing the hard work of reading through the 1,000-page budget and filing the Freedom of Information Act requests.
And don't take the digital part for granted. Daniel's right that a digital government can be more efficient, but we have to make sure that efficiency doesn't come at the cost of our rights. Ask questions about how your data is being used. If the government launches a new app for public safety, does it also track your location 24/7? Efficiency is great, but it shouldn't be a Trojan horse for surveillance.
Well said. Democracy is a high-maintenance system. It requires a lot of user input to keep it running correctly. It's not a set it and forget it type of government. It requires constant calibration and constant vigilance.
It's been a fascinating deep dive. Daniel, thank you for sending that in. It really pushed us to think about how we quantify things that often feel intangible. We talk about freedom and justice all the time, but seeing them as data points on a dashboard makes them feel more manageable, more something we can actually work on.
Yeah, it's easy to talk about freedom in the abstract, but it's much more useful to talk about judicial appointment protocols or media ownership concentration. That's where the real work of maintaining a democracy happens. It's in the boring details.
Before we wrap up, if you're enjoying these deep dives into the weird and wonderful prompts Daniel and others send us, we'd really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app. It genuinely helps other people find the show and join the conversation. We love seeing the community grow.
It really does. And remember, you can find all our past episodes, including the ones we mentioned today about the light rail in episode 611, the air quality crisis in episode 475, and the Otsma experience in episode 448 at myweirdprompts.com. We've got a full archive there, and a contact form if you want to send us your own thoughts or a prompt of your own.
You can also reach us at show@myweirdprompts.com. We're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and pretty much everywhere else you get your audio. We love hearing from you, even if it's just to tell us we got a fact wrong, or to share your own experience with your local bureaucracy.
And a quick shout out to Suno. All the music you hear on the show is generated with their AI. It's amazing what's possible these days, and it fits our theme of exploring the intersection of technology and human systems.
It really is. All right, Herman, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. My brain is definitely a bit fuller, and I'll be looking at my government apps a little differently from now on.
Same here. It's been a pleasure as always, Corn.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We'll be back soon with another one.
Until next time.
Goodbye, everyone.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My weird prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weird.